Well, I love that in our children's time this morning, you all had so many good ideas of possibilities of how the Israelites could have possibly escaped from the advancing Egyptian army. Reminds me of a story that I heard about the time that little Johnny's class studied the story of the crossing of the Red Sea. "Tell us what you learned today, Johnny," his parents said on the way home from church. "Oh, nothing much," said Johnny. "Just about the Israelites crossing the Red Sea." "Oh, tell us how they got across," his mother encouraged. Well, Johnny thought for a bit and then he began to warm up to the subject. He said, "Well, the Egyptians had the Israelites trapped against the sea. So Moses called the engineers and threw a pontoon bridge across. And in the night and the fog, he moved all his troops across to the other side. In the morning, the Egyptians saw what had happened and rolled across the bridge in their tanks. But just before they got to the other side, Moses called in an airstrike and sank the bridge with all the Egyptians on it." "Johnny," his mother said, "you know your Sunday school teacher didn't tell it that way." "Well, not exactly," said Johnny. "But if I told it the way she told it, you wouldn't believe it." It is hard to believe, isn't it? We don't know exactly what happened, how the waters parted, or how various news outlets would have reported the story. We do know that the Israelites were trapped with no power, no solution for their problem, destined for destruction, and God acted to save and deliver them. God made a way where there was no way. Have you ever felt trapped? Like there was no way to move forward? You can't go back, and yet you can't see a path out of where you are either? You feel utterly powerless to make things different? We probably all could think of something right now, an area of our life where we feel that way. It could be a relationship where we feel trapped. It could be our health, our mental health, or our physical health that feels like there's nothing we can do to change it. Many of us struggle with addiction and feel trapped. Grief can make us feel very trapped. Poverty or financial misfortunes or distress can leave us wondering, how in the world can I live? I know, talking with Leanne from People Helping People this past week, that they are seeing so many more clients, especially these past few months, who are doing everything right, who are working hard, and there's just not enough to make ends meet, and they don't know where to turn. And so they come here to People Helping People, the organization that we house here at Muhlenberg, that many different organizations provide financial support for, so that hopefully there is a place for folks to turn. But even that, it's sometimes not enough, and people feel very trapped. Well, whatever the situation that makes us feel trapped, it's easy to think that we have to save ourselves. Like Johnny in the story, we think that the only way that anything could ever change is through our own force. We have to build the bridge. We have to call in our airstrikes. We have to defeat the enemy on our own. And yet the promise of the Exodus is that God can make a way where there is no way. Let's look again at the story. We've got the Israelites who are finally escaping from Egypt after hundreds of years of slavery. It had not been an easy journey to get them to that point. As Martin Luther King Jr. writes in his letter from the Birmingham jail, freedom is never given voluntarily by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. After demanding freedom through words, through plagues, Moses was leading the people out when Pharaoh's economic interests make him reconsider the deal. The empire is desperate to maintain power and control, and Pharaoh clings to it, even if it ultimately destroys his own people. And we still today see many rulers around the world who are willing to sacrifice the lives of their people as long as it maintains their own power, or at least their sense of their own power. So the people are at the sea, Pharaoh's armies are drawing near. They can't go forward, bunch of water. They can't go back, the armies are coming. But then there's this really interesting, very human moment where they wish they could go back. What have you done to us? They ask Moses. It would have been better to stay in slavery than to die out here. And it's easy to be critical of them, but we know it's hard to leave a bad situation sometimes. Better the devil you know, right? At least where you are, you know what you're dealing with. But Moses says to the people, do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still. Do not be afraid. God is present and at work on your behalf. Stand firm. Don't run away. Stand ready to see what God will do. And then, perhaps most important, he says, keep still. Now, this is not saying, freeze, don't move a muscle. This is not calling for passivity or complete inaction on their part. This word for keep still, it's a word calling for silence. Silence, be still. What the people have to say in that moment as they're complaining, it's not going to change what God is about to do. And they need to be quiet so that they can see what God is doing. We see this phrase in other places in our tradition as well. I think of Psalm 46, be still and know that I am God. That idea of quieting ourselves so that we can know God in the midst of the craziness of our lives. We sing the hymn, Let All Mortal Flesh Keep Silence. Kind of the same idea. Being silent and stilling ourselves so we can see God's presence breaking into our world. Now, the other reason why we know that keep still is not a call to inaction here is that the very next sentence is God telling Moses, tell the Israelites to go forward. We didn't read that little section of the text. We just had some excerpts from chapter 14. But right after Moses says to the people, be still. Moses then goes to God and says, hey, what's up? And God says, go forward. Why are you complaining to me? Go forward. It's this interesting moment. Why would God rebuke Moses for asking, for praying to God? Why would God say, why are you talking to me? Do what you need to do. But there's this great story, an ancient story from the rabbis in the 2nd century, where it's a midrash, an interpretive passage that was composed by rabbis during that time. They'd look at these texts, they'd ask those questions, and they'd try to think, well, what was going on there? And so this story that came up in the tradition is that God was basically saying to Moses, my children are in trouble. The sea shuts them off on one side, and the enemy pursues them on the other, and yet you stand and make long prayers. Don't you know that there is a time to make long prayers and a time to make short ones? In other words, the rabbi tells us that God is instructing Moses to stop praying so much and to get moving. The ancient rabbi teaches us that the faithful response in the time of need maybe sometimes isn't to turn to God in prayer, but to trust in the abiding relationship that one has with God and do what seems right. And so God says, go. The people are to be still, to pay attention, and then go. Go forward. We do, in those times when we're feeling stuck, we do have to take those next steps forward in faith. We are called to wade in the water and trust in God's promises. The way forward may end up looking very different than what we wanted or what we expected, but God can make a way when there seems to be no way. This fall, we've been looking at God's promises to God's people, and we've seen how it was an unexpected way forward for Noah in the flood. It was an unexpected way forward for Abram and Sarai as they were called to go to a new place. Certainly Joseph wasn't expecting all of the ups and downs of his life, and yet God called them to go, to move forward in faith. And as we continue here through the fall, we'll hear from Joshua and David and Solomon, from the prophets, and finally then to Jesus. A very unexpected way forward as God comes down to earth to be with us, and then to die and be raised again. All of these stories, this big narrative, this big salvation story is leading us there to Easter, and the Exodus is an Easter story. The Israelites had nothing but death around them, and God parts the sea and says, there is life. Go forward into new life. God can make a way where there is no way. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, keep still, and go in faith, knowing that God goes with you each and every step of the way. God can make a way. Amen.